This is topic 1, lesson 7. In this video, we're going to talk about limiting reactant, excess reactant. We're going to be able to apply mole ratios to figure out what the limiting reactant is and the excess reactant. We'll be able to figure out how much excess we have if they're asking for the mass, volume, moles, or particles. We're also going to be able to calculate percent yields using experimental and theoretical yields. So in a reaction, we could describe the reactants as being either limiting or in excess. So if you look at the picture on the left, it's showing you particles. So the limiting reagent is in green and the excess reagent is in red. What happens after the reaction goes to completion, you have these extra red particles floating around here. So since there are extra red pieces, the red is going to represent the excess reagent. All the green pieces or particles were combined with the red and used up. So the one that is going to be left over, the one that's extra, will be what we call the excess. So red here is excess. The one that gets completely used up is the limiting reagent. Since it's completely used up, it's what limits the reaction from going any further. So it's the limiting reactant. Sometimes I think we often will, when we're learning something, think, when is this applicable to real life? And is this actually used in real life? And the answer is yes, limiting reagent is actually really important. So an example of how we could talk about limiting reagent in real life is that certain times chemists will purposely make sure that one reactant is limited so that the reaction uses up all of the limiting reagent. So for example, let's say I want to remove some lead ions and lead nitrate from a contaminated water supply. What you would do is add some sodium carbonate, and what that's going to do is precipitate out the lead carbonate. So what we would do is add extra sodium carbonate to ensure that all the lead ions reacted, and so they're removed from the water supply. So we're purposely adding a reagent to make sure that we can remove what it is that we're desiring. So definitely has some application to real life. Okay, so let's look at a chemical reaction where we're trying to determine what the limiting reagent is. Here's a reaction. Hydrogen plus oxygen gives you water. What we're trying to figure out is which one is the limiting reactant. So our reactants are hydrogen and oxygen. So the problem tells us that we have 2 moles of hydrogen. So what you're going to do is basically just a mole-mole ratio to figure out how many moles of water we can produce. So you start with your given 2 moles of hydrogen times there are 2 moles of hydrogen and 2 moles of water. So our mole ratio here is 2 to 2, which produces 2 moles of water. Look at your oxygen. You have 2 moles of oxygen. So 2 moles of oxygen, set up your mole ratio. You have 2 moles of water over 1 mole of oxygen. There's a 1 here. And that tells us that we would be able to make 4 moles of water. So from 2 moles of hydrogen, you could only make 2 moles of water. From 2 moles of oxygen, you can make 4 moles of water. Since the hydrogen is only able to make 2 moles of water, it limits the reaction. It's able to produce less water. So hydrogen is our limiting reagent, which would mean oxygen is our excess reagent. And just something to keep in mind is sometimes people will ask, how do you know it's a limiting reagent problem? We know it's a limiting reagent problem because they gave us some quantity of both reactants. So how do you know whether you start with the hydrogen or the oxygen to figure out how much water you can make? So when you're given the amounts of both or 2 of the reactants, we know it's a limiting reagent problem. In our next example, we're given grams of ammonia and we're given grams of copper 2 oxide, and what we need to do is figure out the maximum amount of copper that we could form. So first step is going to be take the grams that we have of each reactant and go to moles. After we go to moles of each, we're going to convert that to moles of copper to see which one makes less copper. The one that makes less copper is our limiting reactant. So starting with the ammonia, we have 18.1 grams. We take that to moles by multiplying by our not using dimensional analysis here, 1 mole over 17.04 grams, we get 1.06 moles. And then we convert our moles of ammonia into moles of copper using our mole ratio. So we have 3 moles of copper and we have 2 moles of ammonia. So we're going to multiply by 3 over 2. We get 1.59 moles of copper. We're going to follow the same type of procedure for the copper 2 oxide. So we have 90.4 grams. We bring that into moles. We get 1.14 moles. And then we're going to use the mole ratio to figure out how many moles of copper that we can make. And we're able to make 1.14 moles of copper. So when you look at the results, the ammonia was able to produce 1.59 moles of copper, and the copper 2 oxide was able to make 1.14 moles of copper. Since the copper 2 oxide is able to make less copper, that means it's our limiting reagent. So what happens when all the copper 2 oxide runs out? Well, that means the reaction is no longer going to go. No more copper will be produced. So the maximum amount that we can make, theoretically, is this 1.14 moles. So we have this term called theoretical yield, and it tells us the maximum amount of product we can make, but the theoretical yield is always expressed in grams, and that's important. Make sure you're writing that down. So if I have 1.14 moles of copper, we just convert that to grams, and that tells us what the theoretical yield of our copper is. So 1.14, do our mole to gram conversion, and we get 72.4 grams of copper. So that value in grams is our theoretical yield. It's how many grams you could potentially make based on the mathematics of the equation. The amount that you actually get when you do the experiment that's actually isolated at the end is what we call the actual yield. It's what you get in the lab. Many experiments, when you run, your actual yield isn't going to be less than theoretically possible. And that could be due to things like you made an error in your lab. Sometimes there are side reactions going on. Sometimes your product is contaminated. So a lot of times your actual yield is going to be less than the theoretical yield. Now, what you would want to do is calculate your percent yield. Percent yield is the actual yield, what you got, divided by the theoretical yield times 100. So remember that these values are in grams, so grams divided by grams will cancel out, so there's not going to be a unit for percent yield. So in the previous example, for 18.1 grams of ammonia and 90.4 grams of copper R2 oxide, the theoretical yield was 72.4 grams. If the actual yield is 58.3, what's the percent yield? So it would be actual, 58.3, over theoretical, 72.4, times 100, which gives you 80.5%. Okay, so now here comes your favorite part, calculating excess. We know that we started with 1.06 moles of ammonia, 1.14 moles of copper 2 oxide. We also know that copper 2 oxide is the limiting reagent. So that means that ammonia must be the excess reagent. So we need to figure out how much ammonia is left over. So here are the steps. And you want to think about the steps and maybe rewind this part a couple times to make sure it makes sense, and then we'll go through the math. So first, you want to do is figure out how many moles of excess ammonia reacted. We want to convert the moles of copper 2 oxide, which is our limiting reagent, to moles of ammonia. This will be how many moles reacted. So you're trying to figure out how much ammonia did we actually use up. Then we want to convert the number of moles to grams. And then what you're going to do is take the amount of ammonia that you started with minus the number of grams that you actually reacted in the actual reaction. So we used all of our limiting reagent. We used all 1.14 moles of copper 2 oxide. So let's convert those moles of copper 2 oxide to ammonia. That tells us how much ammonia was actually used or reacted. So we used 0.758 moles of ammonia. Now what we want to do is convert that to grams to figure out how many grams reacted. Okay, so 12.9 grams reacted. We started with 18.1 grams of ammonia. We subtract out how much we actually used. We only used 12.9, and we have 5.2 grams left over. We'll obviously go through more practice in class. Something like excess reagent takes time and processing to fully understand. So at the end of this video, what you want to be able to understand is that reactants can be either limiting or excess. The experimental yield is going to be different from the theoretical yield. Remember that the value for theoretical yield is going to be in grams. You want to be able to solve problems that are going to involve limiting and excess reagent, understand how to calculate theoretical and percent yields.